Okay, Anne, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I know that there are more people coming and we shall be well into 3 figures very soon. And it's wonderful that we have so many attenders at this online event. I'm Anne Summers and chair of the Friends of the Women's Library, and very pleased indeed to be welcoming Professor Mary Evans to what is a Women's Library event, but also an event which is part of the series around the exhibition, Making Modern Women. You should find a link to the exhibition website in the chat. You can also, of course, find it on the LSE website, and it's really worth seeing. For those of you on Twitter, the hashtag is LSE Making Modern Women. There will be subtitles for this talk. So if the sound on your machine plays up, or if you've got a hearing difficulty anyway, click on the CC closed caption at the bottom of your screen, and you will see live captions. As usual, you will be able to put questions. Please do use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And Mary and myself will be able to see the questions. And Mary will answer as many as possible in the time available. As many of you know, Mary Evans is visiting professor at the Department of Gender Studies at LSE and has published many books. And today she's speaking on her new book, Making Respectable Women, Changing Moralities, Changing Times. And this was published by Palgrave Macmillan last year. Well, there are so many layers of meaning to respectability and femininity, and Mary has studied the ways in which the assessment of being or not being respectable has applied to women over the last 150 years in this country. But in this talk today, she will concentrate on how growing popular culture, magazines, cinema, and so on, in the interwar years, shifted expectations in this area. Over to you, Mary.
Anne, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for being here to chair this session today, which I'm actually absolutely delighted to be able to speak at. And thank you too for Gillian Murphy and Debbie Chellis for having done much of the work to put this event together. So, as Anne said, I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which in the interwar years, and very specifically the period which this extraordinary exhibition has illustrated, how ideas changed about what women ought to be. I fully realise that this is an ongoing subject, which in 2021 is as much disputed as always. But it's also, I think, important to say that because the theme to which I'm going to be talking this afternoon is actually about both continuity and change. Now, I'm going to take a slight liberty with history and start not in the 1920s and the 1930s, but in 1814. And I'm going to start with a quotation from a novel by Jane Austen, Mansfield Park, which was first published in that year. Now, in this novel, the heroine, a young woman called Fanny Price, is being chastised by her very rich uncle, Sir Thomas Bertram, for turning down an offer of marriage from a very, very respectable, or not particularly respectable, but a very rich young man. And in a very long speech, which is often the kind of speech which self-important patriarchs choose to make, Sir Thomas says this to Fanny, and I quote, "I had thought you peculiarly free from wilfulness of temper and every tendance to that independence of spirit which prevails so much in modern days, even in young women." Fanny, her uncle goes on, shows a very perverse determination to make her own choices and to refuse the guidance of others. Fanny is stepping outside what is construed in 1814, not so much by the author herself, certainly not by Jane Austen, but by Sir Thomas Bertram, of what makes a respectable young woman. Now, I'm citing this quotation by Austen because it suggests to me some of the contradictions and difficulties and complexities of definitions of the modern. And first of all, of course, is the recognition in the 19th century, very early in the 19th century, that there is such a thing as the modern at that particular time, a world which is definitively different from previous epochs. And the second, and very much the basis of what I want to talk about here, is the baggage of the word modern, its various meanings, its continuing use in the past 200 years, and what it means and what it has meant for women. Being modern, modernization and modernizing are often spoken of with the assumption of the positive and the progressive. But the implicit meanings of the modern are, I think, more than a straightforward endorsement of change, but is always for the better. Sir Thomas Bertram, the patriarch of Jane Austen's novel, was, as Edward Said pointed out some decades ago, a plantation owner in the West Indies, and thus almost inevitably associated with Atlantic slavery. It is Fanny, and only Fanny in that novel, who asks about these estates and the question of the abolition of slavery. From this, and from Fanny's refusal of, if not exactly a forced marriage, then at least a coerced one, that we might read her as exactly that modern woman with views and opinions of her own, who so frightens Sir Thomas and of course millions of people like him, both then and now. But what I'm particularly concerned with, and what I'm going to go on to talk about now, is that relationship between being modern and yet at the same time maintaining a certain kind of respectability. It's about, and the word fashion will occur much later and much more often in this paper, but it is about literally fashioning the modern meaning of the respectable. So, one thing I think I finally want to say about Fanny here is that although she has this incredible independence of spirit and she holds her nerve in the face of this tirade from Sir Thomas, she's also very skeptical of what we might describe as contemporary, modern, worldly, urban life. Modern she might be in her assumption that women have a right to choose their husbands and ask questions about politics, but she's got no inclination towards that giddy roundabout of fashion and change, which becomes so much part of lives of women in the interwar years. Fanny Price then might be said to embody some of the contradictions of those very interwar years of the 20th century, to which I shall now turn. And so I want you to take that leap from the English countryside in the second decade of the 19th century to the years immediately after the First World War. On the way to 1918, women had fought for various rights, and by 1928, all women had the right to vote and at the same time also to be members of Parliament. Urban life had become an increasingly common experience, and with it, possibilities for consumption which had previously been unknown. The world immediately after 1918, throughout the mass media, was awash with excitements about new forms of technology, a new language about breakthroughs, about science, about progress, about development. And all these words begin to crop up in all the kinds of culture that we, or us then, were exposed to. Women shortened their skirts, cut their hair, and took up the many possibilities of the new forms of mass consumption. But even so, we have to notice how these early changes that were read as modern, were also so much contested at the time. when Nancy Mitford, the author, had her hair cut in the 1920s, her father remarked darkly that, and I quote, "Nobody is going to marry you now." So it was a new world which wasn't welcome to all. Male writers such as H.G. Wells and Arnold Bennett had already spoken with trepidation about the new woman, the modern woman. And the perception of the modern was a culture which, of course, was not necessarily one which everybody could endorse. And so we seem to be encountering a tradition here, not just of generalized misogyny, but a tradition in which the misogyny is directed, not just generally, but against a specific kind of woman, in fact, that modern woman. So we also, of course, have to consider that that tradition is alive and well. But when we return to that interwar period in the UK, what we see is a mass media which was able, for the very first time in British history, to communicate not just information, but visual information about real women, about their behavior, about their appearance. Newsreels, films, increasingly all kinds of representations of the female became available on a hitherto unknown scale. And these decades too saw the founding of great cosmetic houses, such as those of Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein. So within this particular context of the modernization between 1918 and 1939, what I want to do is to look at three themes, which I think were very, very important in the making of the look, the visual appearance of the modern woman, and how that appearance was also tied to ideas about the respectable, about what should and should not be done. So, first of all, I want to emphasize how much the female body became a place of righteous work. It became a place in which the Protestant ethic could really be exercised. An advertisement from a magazine of this period is emphatic that it's up to the individual to maintain not just a healthy body, but a certain form of a healthy body. It all begins, one advertisement read, "With your body, make it alert and make it upright." And two quotations from advertisements for the products of Elizabeth Arden further demonstrate this view. The advertising copy states that, and I quote, "There are no ugly women, there are only lazy women." And another example, and again I quote, "There is no excuse for tired eyes and sagging skin." So do not, these advertisements are saying, just resign yourself to the onset of age, tiredness, exhaustion, whatever else. You have a right, but you also have, much more important than this, you have a responsibility to go on maintaining a certain kind of appearance. And these ideas, of course, which first confronted us on a mass scale in the 1920s and the 1930s, are of course part of a tradition that establishes more recent ideas about letting yourself go and being high maintenance. On March 21st of this year, a headline in the Guardian newspaper asked the question about whether or not Britain, and I quote, had let itself go during lockdown. There's still attached to this idea the connotation that sometimes there's a kind of laziness, a kind of refusal to take the body seriously, to do the right thing by the body, which of course is being expressed here. And this idea, as I say, I think had roots in the 1920s. The idea that the body was a machine to be maintained and rigorously policed for evidence of neglect. It's all about working on the body, taking exercise, taking advantage of those cosmetics which are increasingly endorsed through forms of quasi-scientific evidence. The science which is bringing new forms of machinery to the world is apparently bringing that exercise to the individual body of a woman. And it's further impossible to read cosmetic advertisements in the 1920s and the 1930s without seeing a consistent valoration of youth and youthfulness. It's also remarkable by the standards of 2021 that old age began as what is now regarded as a really quite young age. The second theme that I want to mention here is that which is something which is, I think, in large part an answer to the question of what all this work on the body, all this effort is actually for. In one sense, of course, it is, as we're often told these days, it's about women for themselves. It's to make ourselves feel better. The advice and diet is probably good for us now as it was then. But the purpose of maintaining the female self is often very firmly and explicitly located in approval by the male gaze, for its approval, and at least as importantly, for the offer of marriage. Now, there's a particularly telling answer in, I think, a 1934 edition of Home Notes, which is a fairly middle-range women's magazine. And this answer comes from an agony aunt commenting on a young woman whose engagement to marriage has just been broken. And the agony aunt writes, "If Fenella, who had loved John very, very much, remembered him every moment of the day, she might lose her fresh, laughing look, ruin her health, and put up a barrier between herself and every other young man who might have come along and made her happy." So Fenella is very strongly advised to maintain her fresh and laughing look because it's going to make sure that she'll be able to secure a husband. And this aim for women remains central in the magazines of the interwar years. It is, if you like, about harnessing this modern look within the confines of a particular form of relationship, that of heterosexual marriage. So along the references to high-achieving women who are pictured as embodying the modern, there runs a very rich and arguably much more widely endorsed parallel theme of the importance of marriage and forms of approval that are quite explicitly male. Thus, in one magazine in which advertisements for corsetry are designed as perfect for freedom-loving moderns, there's also the assertion that maintaining youthfulness of the freedom-loving modern is essential for achieving marriage. A third and final theme here is that of the social function and positioning of the body and its appearance. That theme takes us to speculation about fears, about social mixing and the blurring of classed and racialized forms of the visual recognition of others. Women in interwar cosmetic advertising are almost always encouraged to avoid looking coarse or rough. These are coded, classed and racialized references which should alert us to the implicit social needs for social differentiation which are beginning to be expressed here. Skin whitening had been known in the UK since the 15th century, probably before. But as the taste for holidays in warmer climates took hold, it also brought with it problems about the meaning of changes in skin colour. A differentiation here was very important between a complexion changed by leisure and a complexion changed by the impact of hard work. So this new culture has given us, by the start of the Second World War, a visual idea of what modern womanhood might look like and how the limits of that respectable look might possibly be maintained. It is, of course, a look which is very far from necessarily reflected in the actual appearance of the general population. The argument I want to pursue here, then, is not the extent to which anybody followed any of these strictures of the various cosmetic and fashion houses, but I want to ask two questions about why this ideal found such a fertile ground in the interwar years, and why and how the ideal of a modern woman came to play a significant part in wider political contexts. The first question is in many ways the easy question to answer. Between the wars, the historian Selina Todd has estimated that by 1931, in urban areas, young women constituted 42% of the UK's clerical workforce. Women, largely unmarried women, were in paid work and had a degree of disposable income. The urban here, I think, is very important because that context gave women both the place in which to buy goods and services, but also somewhere for display. That famous 19th century masculine flaneur of the city streets, who was so beloved of Baudelaire in the mid-19th century and subsequently Walter Benjamin, could now also be female. Going out, going shopping became urban female pastimes, and respectable female pastimes at that. Being in a city centre lost that taint of unrespectability, which it might have had at one time before. So employment and context provided a perfect mix of customers and providers, or to put it another way, willing and eager consumers of the products of a new form of capitalism. Going out no longer involved for many women chaperonage, hats, gloves, all the previous signifiers of the respectable. What replaced these ideas involved new contradictions in judgments. Just to give you one example here of this kind of contradiction. In 1936 in Germany, the Simone de Beauvoir was very forcibly told off for applying lipstick in a women's cloakroom. Yet in the same country, scantily dressed women were encouraged to perform gymnastics. And so in much the same way, interwar magazines went to some effort both to provide information about beachwear, but they generally accompanied it by strictures about where to wear it, which was, of course, fairly obvious to most readers, but more tellingly, and I think this is the more important point, how to cover it up and when and how this beachwear should be worn. So all these new fashions, all the new goods that could be purchased and consumed by a new material base of a larger number of women with more disposable income became part of the extension of the modern woman in the more democratic ways of mass consumption. The history of women in Britain is sometimes written as if the social class of women did not exist, but gains in suffrage, higher education, and exceptional forms of female achievement were somehow classless and generally unproblematically generally relevant. We have seen that women came to occupy a considerable part of the white-collar workforce in the 1930s, but this should not obscure the fact that many working-class women had long been in paid employment, and that all women, except for a privileged minority, performed in various circumstances the responsibilities of care. The latter, of course, remains to this day and has become part of that well-known definition of the second shift. So what we see in the interwar years has to be seen in terms of both a shift of the place of women in the UK workforce and the place that this context gave women for both greater disposable income and for more personal mobility in urban areas. Part of that greater mobility meant that women could move to work and live lives with a degree of independence from their home communities. The policing in certain ways decreased. You could be respectable in new ways. Homes were nevertheless provided. A kind of early sheltered housing for women started to be part of the urban landscape of the of these decades of the 20th century. And I think interestingly, the lives of these young women became fictionalized in the writing of such authors as J.B. Priestley and even T.S. Eliot. They became a new phenomenon. These women were no longer aberrant women living in urban spaces, but a new kind of female person. So that second issue, I think, is the second issue then is the wider place of modern women in wider political and social discussions. And I think there are two very important themes here. The first relates to the question, which is first expressed precisely in those decades, in fact in 1929 by Joan Riviere, about whether or not there is actually such a thing as the feminine. Riviere suggests that femininity is a masquerade. Writing much later, in fact writing in the 21st century, John Jervis has pointed out, and I quote, "Masquerade represents femininity, but femininity is representation anyway, and fashion becomes the primary site of the masquerade." And I think those words are really very important here, and to what we might and what they might enable us to think about these transformations of the interwar years. When we start to examine that idea a bit more closely, what we see is that in the connections between the feminine, its representation, and fashion, there has to be an endless dynamic of change. Fashion by its very nature can never be static. The feminine then becomes attached to and represents ideas about change, improvement, and self-realization, which are as fundamental to the 20th century as views on religious practice were in the 17th. So all those ideas that the cosmetic and fashion advertisements had actually displayed and articulated were making a new ethic not so much about how people in general should be, but in very specific forms about what women should be. So in what was being discussed, represented, as part of that apparent journey towards a definitive but completely unobtainable femininity, women and the feminine become the primary forms of the representation of the modern. Dress, deportment, the making of the home, forms of sexuality come together around women in ways that I think have not been the same for men. Thus, in a very curious irony, men who have long taken little or no part in, for example, domestic life or expectations about fashion or appearance are excluded from part of the very dynamic which helps to maintain that very world which they operate and rule. The second theme which I want to mention here is the idea of the making of desire. Specifically here, the desire for things or goods. It was in the 1930s, in fact, that a banker employed by the Lehman Brothers remarked that, and I quote, "People must be trained to desire." Now, he wasn't talking, of course, about desiring each other in a sexual sense or an erotic sense. What he was talking about is being trained to want things. The same lesson, Lisa Roffel has pointed out, had to be learned in other places in the 20th century, most particularly in the context of her work in China in the late 20th century. The kind of desire issue here is, of course, the desire to own certain kinds of material objects, and through them to be a particular kind of person. And the person that we're talking about here is the modern and respectable woman. That level of desire is easily understood and, of course, is today communicated across the globe. But in another, and I think more intangible way, that desire to be modern, to look modern, has more complex implications than that simply of dress. Those implications are about the often contradictory positions which women in the early 20th century occupy, and which were first most often voiced and explored in those interwar years. In short, the demand that women should be both modern and traditional. The traditional expectation of women of care persisted in those decades and of course persists today, while at the same time ever-increasing demands are made about appearance. One of the many accusations sometimes levelled against women in the mass media is that they have become greedy. As various writers in the women's magazines of the 1930s were keen to point out, modern women could not and should not easily forget that they were supposed to be wives and mothers. It's extraordinary how many times in advertisement copy, in advice to women, in articles about women's lives, what is at the really central core of those articles and those texts is how women have got to manage that appearance of being modern with its reconciliation alongside and with more traditional tasks of caring and looking after others. Thus, those endless and endlessly repeated sections of text in women's magazines, how to be both young and modern, but at the same time expressive of that conservatism which authors such as Alison Light have identified as characteristic in other ways of the 1930s. So, I want to conclude here with a couple of final paragraphs of speculation about what we might consider about the 1920s and the 1930s and how that relates to where we are in 2021. I think it was perhaps the arrival of a form of contraception in the 1960s, which finally allowed heterosexual desire to be reliably separated from the birth of children, which gave to women and to people and to men, to the human race in general, a greater degree of agency and control. But alongside this, and to return to Joan Revere and the interwar years, that always mythical concept of the feminine at that time and then becomes even more problematic. The style of the modern woman, so much vaunted in those the 1920s and 1930s, becomes more difficult to define. The certainty of a previous form of the representation of modern women, body conscious and fully aware of dress and social engagement, becomes a woman who arguably has become even more masked than previous decades, given that new freedoms and a greater expectation for and toleration of diversity of appearance have appeared, although emphatically not without challenge. At the same time, the existence of many new forms of appearance available to women and many aspects of personal choice have become symbolic of the modern itself. Thus, we can see that perhaps women have not so much become modern women as magazines and advertising copy of the interwar years suggested, but that the very symbol of the possible plurality of the modern. The shift in that relationship, the apparent feminization of the modern as it might be described, has important consequences which have manifested themselves in forms of politics which attempt to challenge that very diversity of the modern and modernity, and both of which and all of which play a central part in global politics. In this, the refusal of the many forms of the modern woman takes us back to that fear expressed by Sir Thomas Bertram of that independence of spirit which might possibly be found in women, and which of course is a real challenge and a consistent challenge to other more traditional norms. In conclusion then, I've no doubt that the interwar years in the UK saw a fundamental shift in the representation of women and the feminine. Although this was powered through new material interests and circumstances, what cannot be overlooked is the association in many contexts, both in advertising and other parts of the mass media, of women with a rhetoric of new forms of freedom. We can note the policing of women's dress in some authoritarian regimes, but at the same time we can also note that aspects of the creation of the new or the more modern woman has had, in some ways, generally negative consequences. Whatever our thoughts about this, I think what we can say is that this exhibition, this wonderful exhibition, encourages us to think about the ways in which the idea of the modern woman is, like the idea of the modern itself, many textured. So thank you, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was absolutely fascinating. And I hope people will be putting their questions in the Q&A, but I'm going to sneak my own question in first, of course. And that is, as well as the texts and the subtexts in magazines, which are about getting married, getting a man to marry you, are there texts and subtexts about maintaining that marriage? Is there a balance of some kind, or maybe it's rather uncomfortable, between being frightfully traditional and making yourself attractive and looking young with modern cosmetic products? I mean, there must be something, some advice out there.
I think my reading of the magazines across quite a wide social range, from the Tatler and Vogue and so on, to the much more mass market magazines, there's a huge emphasis on maintaining youthfulness, on maintaining what people want to talk about as the magic of the relationship. I mean, it's interesting how very often the kind of almost the supernatural is actually implicated in marriage, that somehow or other, you know, you've got to keep that spark alive. And one of the ways, of course, in which you can do it is by maintaining this, for women, is maintaining this endlessly youthful and attractive female self, the body, the face, the clothes, and so on and so forth. Not letting yourself go. I mean, the coercive strength of this idea, I think, becomes such an important one. And I mean, it's clearly something which has continued and continues to this day. And it is a kind of stricture that is being imposed on women. And, you know, this is part of your responsibility. It's part of what a respectable person should be doing. And again, I emphasize here how much it is something that is expected of you as a right-thinking woman. You know, you've got to keep at it, to keep maintaining yourself. And that through maintaining yourself, of course, you're going to maintain the affection of others.
Yes, yes, actually, and you have reminded me that my mother and one of her sisters, and can I say they were both very beautiful women always, were upbraided by some of their contemporaries because they let their hair go white. You know, and this is, we're talking about the 50s. Mm. So, yes, when I would have thought hair dye was less common, but I'm obviously not right there. And also I wanted to ask, do you think World War I itself, as well as consumer capitalism, enabled the female flaneur? Because during the war, women were war workers and they often wore uniform, and so they wouldn't be accosted in the street, and people got used to the end of chaperonage.
I think it's complicated because, of course, many of those, I mean, what the First World War put paid to was domestic service primarily, because there's a switch in where working class women are working. That's the most important thing. So I think the most important change that occurred is that shift in female labour markets enabled more women across the social scale to take advantage of urban life. And so I don't think it was a change that, I mean, moving into paid work was not so general in the First World War as it was in the Second. I mean, the mobilization did not take part on such an organized scale as it did in the Second World War. But I do think you're absolutely right in saying that, you know, there was new ways, I mean, in which women actually interacted with men, which were no longer personal. They were simply a matter of, I'm here doing a job, you're there receiving my services. The kind of social exchanges which were possible, I think, were transformed. I think that's what was so important. So you were the person in the shop selling the goods. You were the person in the factory helping taking part in the production line, etc., etc. You became not just a woman, but you became part of a certain form of social relationship. And I think that's the basic transformation that took place.
That's very interesting. There's a question from Gillian Murphy saying, now you mentioned J.B. Priestley, and in connection with another author. Who was the other author?
The other author is T.S. Eliot, and there's a passage in the Waistline where he talks about one of these young women, one of these independent young women in her bedroom, washing her underwear. I can't remember the exact passage, but it is so much evokes this picture of a young independent woman living by herself, looking after herself. And these young women acquire a certain degree of classlessness almost. And I think that this is hugely important about it, because this new urban woman could be both middle class in the sense of having had some form of post-compulsory education, but she could also be on the fringes between, she could be lower middle class, she could be working in a shop, etc., etc. But the point is, it becomes a new category of person. And I think that that's what T.S. Eliot was actually attempting to evoke in this poem. But it's also, for example, in Angel Pavement, the woman, the office worker that Priestley is writing about. And, you know, she's living in this kind of sheltered housing, but also she's really eager. She very much wants to find a husband. She wants to get out of this situation which she's in. And what, of course, is still very much part of the 20s and the 30s is that for the vast majority of women, although there is this new possibility of being in paid work in an urban place, it's a transition. It's a transition to marriage. I don't think the idea of, you know, certainly the idea of paid work over a lifetime has still not become common. That occurs much, much later in the 20th century.
Thank you. Mary, there's a question from someone called Pira, just sort of continuing on the theme of World War I and the impact, and asking whether the loss of so many marriageable men of a couple of cohorts during World War I, would the marketing for youthful looks tap into competition for mates? Do you think, to which one might add, do you think the competition was stronger than it might have been?
I mean, I think that decimation of a generation was hugely important. But I think you also have to remember that it was constantly that impact was constantly disappearing, because of course a later generation was growing up and reaching marriageable age. So I think it's very difficult to assess its impact. I mean, much of it has been made of the idea of, you know, a huge relief when the war was over, the new jazz age, etc., etc. All these pictures of the bright young things released from this terrible, you know, this terrible military conflict and so on and so forth. But I think it's a very partial picture, and I think it's a picture which was also quite fleeting, that say by the late 1920s, the demography of the population had stabilized, so that there wouldn't be the same impact on people of marriageable age as there had been perhaps in the early 1920s. You know,
I'm sure that's right, Mary, because the age, you know, it wasn't an aging population. As
exactly. Yeah.
People had much bigger families, and, you know, there were younger brothers who had not been called up.
In the war. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, there's a long question from someone called Ritesh about representation. And Ritesh wonders if you would say that perhaps the masculine is a representation as well, and possibly one from which other representations derive.
I think the representation of masculinity in women's magazines, which is what I'm going to speak to now, I think is a really interesting one, because my reading of it in those magazines, and again across the social range, is that it's extraordinarily fixed. And of course it's not fixed necessarily in terms of dress, because men look different according to their age and their social situation. But the consistency of the representation is about a human who must in some way be appeased, be thought about. And I think it's that element of the representation of masculinity which is so important in terms of what women are being encouraged to be like. It's presenting a consistent person who must be, if you like, thought about, considered, pleased, encouraged. That's what I think is important about the representation there of masculinity, because of course, you know, this is potentially the person who will provide material support, who will provide social status, who will provide a life which is also being alongside this modern, emancipated, city-based life, being presented as increasingly, well, as consistently important.
The ultimate authority, the ultimate reference point.
Yes, but also reference point which, you know, has to be nurtured, has to be looked after, has to be pleased, has to be, and I think it's that kind of coded expectation about, look, this gender has to be, this is a gender that we have to be nice to, and if possible, make ourselves acceptable to. And I think that it's that dynamic much more than any kind of particular visual representations, which is really important to look for. And I think that would be such an interesting dynamic to trace.
Well, indeed, there are two very large questions about the present day. One is from Mayara Porto, who wonders what your opinion is on the impact of social media on women's self-esteem and self-image. And then one is from Katrina Waters, wondering if you see similarities, differences between the tensions you've presented for the interwar period and possibly similar tensions in a post-feminist era or third wave feminism. So I think those two questions suggest the modern world, some reflections.
Okay, the modern world, some reflections. I'm peculiarly unable to answer questions about social media because my connection with it, my use of it is so limited. I have a very strong, I mean, I'm aware of such things as the sidebar of shame, for example, the policing which you can read about online of women's bodies. I think that is entirely and absolutely negative, and you never ever, or you very, very seldom get the same kind of policing of men's bodies. You don't get the stuff about looking looking toned, losing your baby weight. And the thing that often strikes me as most remarkable, just as something that might be achieved, as looking effortlessly chic. Now, this seems to me to be such a contradiction in terms that it's just amazing that it still continues. Anyway, so on the whole, I think social media in its visual elements is highly negative, and in terms of body image representations of women. I think that would be my considered opinion there. I don't see much positive about it, although it has to be said at the same time. So it can be said that through social media, people can very much express their antagonistic feelings about ideas of body size, body appearance, etc., etc. So it's not that I am not saying that there isn't a place there for resistance and for critique, because clearly that place is there and it's an important place. The tensions, I think the tension is certainly there, but I don't think quite in the same way as it's in the 1920s and the 1930s. I do think the 1920s and the 1930s were a kind of peri dish for the modern. I think they were hugely important decades for creating ideas about what it meant to be a modern woman. But I think a lot of the strengths, say, of the importance of heterosexual marriage, the importance of certain kinds of appearance, I think that singularity of expectation has been fractured, and that's what I meant when I said in conclusion that I think the perception of the modern woman has become much more plural. And that means that, of course, I think that there are much more, if anything, the tensions have not disappeared, but they've become more diffuse, but not necessarily any less intense. So that would be my comment there.
Thank you for that. And I may say lots of messages have come through saying thank you, Mary, for such a fascinating talk. And there is a question from Susan Wolfe, and it would seem to be definitely from an American background. And she says, well into the 60s, there was still the expectation that as young women, we went to university to get a job in which we could support the husband we would meet as he finished medical school, and then supported us for life in the manner to which. Looking back, it seems like yesterday. Can I say, Susan, I agree, it seems like yesterday. And Susan says, I knew a young woman who always studied in the law library so she would meet young men with the potential to be US senators because her life goal was to be First Lady. Always wondered what happened to her. Was this sort of thing also going on over here in UK universities? Thank you. Susan, well, I don't know about you, Mary. I think it wasn't quite so blatant here, was it?
I don't think it was quite so blatant, but I think, I mean, my comment on that is what I would need to know in the 1960s, I very strongly suspect that in the 1960s, a higher proportion of an age cohort went into higher education in the United States than in the UK. I went to university as an undergraduate in the 1960s, and at that point, 5% of my age cohort went into higher education. And of that 5%, a very small minority were women, probably something like 20% is my guess, and it is only a guess. So that any woman who went to university in any university in this country was immediately in a male environment. I mean, it was inescapable. You might have gone to a women's college at Oxbridge, but the point was that the university as a whole was a male space. I do not recollect having, for example, been taught by a woman when I was an undergraduate, except very briefly by a woman teaching assistant in my first year. So we went into a male world, and I think in that sense, expectations were that many people would, many marriages, many relationships would be made. The interesting thing about the United States is that reading Sylvia Plath, for example, on her time at Smith College, which is not the 60s, but is earlier than that, she often comments on women who dropped out of university in order to get married. And it wasn't so much that, you know, business done. By the second year, they had the engagement ring and off they went to get married. So I was really struck by that reading it, because the thought of dropping out of university to get married seemed to me, when I read that, to be a really remarkable change, certainly from where I was in the 1960s. So those are just some comments on that question.
I have a note that Debbie Chalice would like to answer that too. Is that right, Debbie? No.
No.
Because Debbie is muted. But Susan, that is a great question, I must say. I do remember that in America, again in the 60s, it was much more common then for people to go on to do doctorates.
Yes.
And, you know, famously, they were married and the wife was earning the living and, of course, typing up the doctorate. And Fiona Hackney has said that she was told in the 1970s at my viva at Edinburgh College of Art that I was only there to find a man. And she was told this by the head of her viva, the college principal, in the 1970s. Yes, and I remember a friend of mine who had married and went to Scotland in 1966 and had always hoped to make her career in local government, being told that married women were not employed in local government in Scotland. So I can well believe what Fiona Hackney says. This one will run and run, won't it? Mary, you'll have to write another book. I think we're all very much looking forward to reading this one. And Jenny Worstel has said, right, another big question. Well, no, one we can share the answers to. As we come out of lockdown, what are your thoughts about the way the media have already started encouraging us to dress up more, get out of those elastic waisted skirts and trousers, slap on the makeup, etc. Not to mention sorting out our lockdown hair before we can be seen in respectable company.
My comment is always recognize the importance that the financial pages of any newspaper pay to the health of the high street. I mean, I really do think that it needs to be said. I mean, very often, you know, fashion and cosmetics are regarded as some kind of peripheral nonsense. But in fact, the part that they play in the economy is really, I think, much more important than people sometimes recognize. And of course, that is so much on the whole, I mean, obviously not exclusively, but it is so much about perceptions of womanhood.
Yes, and yes, we're expected to do our duty to the high street.
Yeah, exactly. We're supposed to be doing our bit for the high street, and you know, the high street has to keep on telling us to renew ourselves, and you know, so we are expected to live in this state of sort of constant renewal.
Yes.
Which
is flipping exhausting. Yes.
Very expensive, entirely impossible, but
but yes, there it is. I think we're coming towards the end of our time, and it's been tremendously enjoyable. I'm longing to read the book and to get myself really up to date with all this. And clearly you have now to write the next book. These questions have made that perfectly clear. And Yes, I absolutely agree. Susan Wolfe writes, thank you so much for making me laugh and think. And remember, this has been great. And I absolutely agree. Everybody do, if you haven't already seen it, have a look at the exhibition online, Making Modern Women. It really is very good indeed. There may also be a survey, and a link may be found in the chat to help LSE plan library events in future. I'm just checking that no one else has been left out. Debbie Chalice reminds us that Time and Tide is an important part of the exhibition, and the Time and Tide project of the last 12 months is also something to look up online, I'm very happy to say. And with that, with the many messages of thanks to Mary, I will bring this session to a close. Thank you all for joining us. And I hope some of you are able to go out and enjoy the sunshine. Many thanks, Mary, including greetings from one of your old research students, from Kent.
Thank you.
Everybody stay safe and well, and I hope we'll all meet again very soon, if only on screen. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.